Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and it's time once again for another RPG, Storytime, and I'm going to continue the tale of my campaign that basically was about the return of the Bloodlord. Now, this second arc is where a lot of my notes begin to have holes in them, because my logs were kind of corrupted from that time, because this was a decade ago, more than that in some instances, So at this point, my logs started falling off, so I have to rely on my memory, and my memory ain't what it used to be. Although I like to think that it's still pretty high up there. But so I may get some of these details wrong or out of order. I'll try and do my best here. Now, when last we left, I was just basically talking about the epic start to the campaign, which was a lot of really nice action sequences. At least I tried to make them nice. Shoehorned in. I wasn't really shoehorned in, but I managed to work them in to the typical getting to know everybody, getting characters' details worked out, getting used to their abilities and such, that kind of thing. This is all about a 3.5 campaign back in the day, if you didn't watch the first part. If you didn't watch the first part, I do encourage you to go look at it. So what do we have here? We have basically the end of the first arc and the second arc kind of combined into one. And at this point, you know, early sections of there's kind of a give and take there, because early sections of the second arc, the second storyline, as it were, that I began to weave those into the story as the party explored what they found out to be a dungeon that carried them much of the way through the second arc, even though it was not actually involved with it. And that's called Haunted Hill. Now, for those who have not heard me say that one before, Haunted Hill was a 2-level dungeon that I had designed behind what I thought was a relatively modest design. At least I thought that at the time. It turned out to be on average larger than a lot of 3.5 dungeons were for that level range, but I wasn't really into published modules at that time, so I didn't realize that. I was basing it off of my 2nd edition experience. I thought it was a modest dungeon by 2nd edition standards. Anyway, the original purpose of the dungeon, Haunted Hill, was that it was an old tomb complex set into a hill. The reason it was called Haunted Hill was not because of undead, but because of strange goings-on and weird lights and such. What ended up happening is, if you remember from the first part of the story where I was talking about the kobolds who had gone into town and they had attacked a bookstore and they had stolen a ritual book and they had basically been making trouble, these kobolds had settled into Haunted Hill and made a warren out of it. They had expanded the dungeon with additional tunnels and chambers. Some of these tunnels were very, very small. In fact, a lot of the entrance tunnels were very, very small, even though it had like a proper tomb entrance. A lot of times you would go in there and there'd be like a tomb room and then like little tunnels just suited for little 2.5 foot tall kobolds going off into the distance. I admit that the dungeon was, as I said, a little bit larger than I expected it to be in terms of challenge and in terms of actual number of rooms, because the party made it out well over level 5 before they exited the thing. It took them from like level 3. They gained about 2 to 3 levels on average. Some of them gained a 4th one, I think, towards the end. Anyway, they went in there. They had a brief quarrel at the very beginning with a cockatrice that had ventured into the area, and that was actually an amusing one, but an amusing encounter, but it wasn't really an epic encounter because it ended up basically going into Ragnar trying to catch the cockatrice alive, which did not work well. And you got to remember, this is before the 4th and 5th edition versions where once you failed to save, you started to turn this to stone. Now, this is still back in the days of save or die type effects. So, yeah, the party did face that cockatrice at relatively low level, and they probably would have been able to take it out without any sort of situation whatsoever if they just dropped it at range. But no, you had this big barbarian trying to catch the cockatrice like a chicken, and he managed to make it out because the first time that it hit him because cockatrices turn you to stone when they hit. When they hit you, it pecked him, and he made his fort save because, of course, he's a barbarian with a large fort save and a large constitution. And then he realized, oh crap, I don't want to be turned to stone as soon as he had to make that fort save, and then they went ahead and finished it off. So, not exactly epic, but if you can imagine this big barbarian kind of chasing this snake chicken that turns people to stone around like it was an actual chicken. Anyway, they go into this tomb, and they're expecting to see undead. The paladin, especially Valdemar the paladin, was hesitating at the very beginning because he was just constantly like, I look for undead, I look for undead. Basically, no undead. It's a tomb with no undead. Sometimes you gotta buck expectations. However, they did start getting harried by kobolds who would not only utilize the traps that were in the tomb, although I didn't actually put that many traps of that sort in there, but they also laid little traps of their own, and they would do hit and run tactics through the little tunnels. So they would go out, shoot someone, and as soon as the party turned on that kobold, it would run away. So even though they were discrete encounters, a lot of clearing the first level was actually, it lasted, I want to say 2 or 3 sessions, wherein instead of just doing discrete encounters, they would engage one encounter, have a few runners, and those would chain other encounters on. So eventually, nobody was shooting these things, because even though a few of them had ranged attacks, they weren't really using them in time to take the kobolds out before they got out of sight. And some of that is on them. They didn't designate anybody to just stand back and shoot these things. And some of it's on me because I intentionally did make the tunnels real twisty and turny, so they really only had 1 round when a kobold started running in order to take it down. And due to the weapon switching mechanics and such with 3rd edition, a lot of times they couldn't make but 1 shot or so, if that, before the kobold was around a corner and out of sight. So they spent a large amount of time basically chaining kobold encounters one after the other, and even though they were distinct encounters, it did end up being basically this mosh pit of just constantly fighting kobolds down different tunnels and getting hit left and right. While they suffered for it, they didn't necessarily lose anybody at that point. It was a rough fight, but it wasn't rough enough to have anybody go down permanently. They did have a few people drop and then get brought up by the NPC healer at the time, who was still, because nobody wants to play healers in my campaigns, or at least not back in the day. I don't know why. Is that a common thing amongst gaming groups? Because a lot of the groups that I've been in, a lot of people don't like to play any sort of healing character. Or they'll play a healing character and they'll decide not to heal or something like that. Anyway, back to the story at hand. They were basically chasing these kobolds around, and as they went deeper and deeper into Haunted Hill, it became very clear that these kobolds were utilizing sort of a diabolical pact, because they started encountering minor devils in this thing. And some of them, they justified it at first with, oh, well, there's devils here. They came in loaded for undead and instead fought kobolds and devils. But they did eventually face a few higher-end devils. They started engaging bearded devils. And at one point, they engaged a couple bearded devils. I think they were bearded devils. And they had summoned... The devils have a power. There's basically, they can summon other devils. A certain % chance a day, they can summon lesser devils. So they were fighting a couple bearded devils. And they did pretty well in the initial round, even with very minimal magic support and everything, very minimal magical weapons and everything. They managed to take these things down by like half their health very swiftly. But then the devils started summoning minor devils, and all of a sudden, the very small chamber and the very packed little tight tunnels that they were in, they just cleared out of kobolds, or not goblins, kobolds. And they were feeling pretty good, and then all of a sudden these bearded devils started summoning minor devils. I think they only used one summon once, because I think that's all they can do. But they summon... I'll have to look it up real quick. It was Lemures. It was Lemures that they managed to summon, and I got the details real quick, and I can look them up. A bearded devil can summon. Bearded devil can summon once per day. Can attempt to summon 2d10 lemures with a 50% chance of success. Or another bearded devil with a 35% chance of success. These two bearded devils, and they are challenge rating 5, and the only reason they were fighting two of them at once was because they triggered 2 encounters, basically. And each of these bearded devils summoned 2d10 lemures. And at this point, the majority of the damage, because devils have damage reduction against certain weapons, basically normal weapons. One of the reasons they had got off with with bringing these bearded devils down by half health right off the bat was because Magnus the wizard basically dumped a lot of damage spells onto them and was able to take them down quite a bit. And then each of them summoned 2d10 lemures. And the dice rolled high. So all of a sudden the group was separated from these bearded devils who did not engage in melee at that point. They basically stepped back. And you got to remember, this isn't a tomb. This is not these broad corridors. These are relatively tight rooms, much of which were taken up by sarcophagi and little niches here and there, and then these little kobold tunnels. And then all of a sudden the group finds themselves in the middle of this relatively compact room already, surrounded by a mosh pit of lemures, which are basically little shapeless devils that look like piles of melted flesh. And thus, the combat slowed to a crawl. Because at this point, they had fairly high AC, the party that is, and they were dealing a fair amount of damage, but they still had very little in the way of magical weapons. So, lemures have a certain amount of DR, damage resistance. So these people were, the party was basically trying to hack and slash through this just mass of lemures. Is that how it's pronounced? Lemures? It sounds a little bit too much like a little furry thing that pops its head out of the ground. Lemures. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Regardless, they spent quite a bit of time just hacking through these minor devils left and right, and it just slowed all the encounters to a crawl. And it was at one point the party was like, they're not killing us, but we're barely killing them. Is there any way to make this faster? I said, yeah, sure. What does your... do any of you have any area of effect spells? And Magnus was like, no, I'm all out. All right, do any of you have any holy water or anything? And Valdemar and the paladin was like, no, I don't carry such things. So they were basically left with no choice but to just slog through this combat. And that's something you really don't want as a DM, is to have combats turn into a slog. Yet for some reason, occasionally mine do, just because of poor planning, both on my part and on the PCs. I will take equal credit for that sometimes. They did eventually overcome it. At one point, they opened up a closet and found nothing but chains inside, like hooked and barbed chains. And they wondered what the purpose of that was. And then they saw a name in there on the closet. And it was like the entrance to the closet had a big ceiling ward, basically said keep out in Draconic, which was what kobolds use. So they opened it up anyway, and they see nothing but this relatively compact room filled with chains. And they see a name on the wall, and one of them had the bright idea of saying, oh, what does... And they said the name. I forget what the name was off the top of my head. And by saying the name, they managed to complete the summoning, which ended up being a chain devil, a chitin. And it animated all the chains in the closet, and then they had to deal with that. So they were hacking their way through this. It turned pretty bad pretty quick, but because I don't play my devils and demons like just minor evils. They are major evils. Even the relatively minor devils are really twisted. So they were finding evidence of human sacrifice. They were finding evidence of even more nefarious things that were being used to bring more devils into being. Really can't get into it here, not without really demonetizing this video. But yeah, they were seeing some really messed up shit by the end of this combat. Which brings me to the point of the final combat, which is they came upon this room. And it was basically a large, tall chamber that spanned both levels of the dungeon. The encounter was situated in the lower portion, where you had a couple devils in the lower portion. They were doing some nefarious things to some captured villagers. And then you had the upper portion, which was actually the remnants of a tomb that had caved in. So at this point, the party had gone back up to the first level, because this dungeon had a lot of ups and downs, and found this room, and looked down this pit in the middle. And the entire first part of this combat for several rounds was only Magnus with his spells and his bow, and the rogue, once again with his short bow, Arliss with his short bow, doing range damage to these guys in the room below, basically trying to pick them off like fish in a barrel. And once again, Valdemar and Ragnar had nothing to do, because they had never picked up ranged weapons at this point. They still hadn't picked up ranged weapons. And they just basically sat there and watched this exchange for a good 5-6 rounds, while the devils below started casting spells up at the people above. And in the meantime, one of the devils finally got irritated and started walking around and basically killing the hostages. And it was only at that point when the paladin decided to say, "Hey, I'm going to jump down. How far down is it?" And I'm like, "Dude, it's like 15 feet down." And he's like, "Oh, well, I could have jumped down a long time ago. I thought it was deeper. I thought it was deeper than that." And I was like, "Well, here's the issue: is that I've described by this time I had described the room to him 3 times. It was a large room, but 3 different times I said, and the floor is 15 foot down. So they should have caught on by then. This is not a verbal description either. This is me typing it out and cutting and paste it. This is text on a screen, because we were playing via IRC. This was text on a screen they could have read, and they missed that glaring thing. A lot of times in my descriptions I give details that people miss for some reason, and that's another thing. I'm not sure whether it's me, the way I write, or just people not paying attention. Anyway, that took them several levels to get to Haunted Hill. That's one of my favorite dungeons. I need to redesign that at some point and bring it up to date. This is actually also where the incident with the half-ogre who wanted to join came in, because we had a new person, and their first character was a half-ogre chain specialist. And you may have heard this story before as well, because he made a half-ogre, and by my setting, I did not have any half-ogres around. Like, they could not be around in the village, or somebody would have noticed them by now, because one of the main enemies they've been facing is ogres. So this guy was a half-ogre, and so I said, "Well, you're going to start X amount away." And he's like, "Okay, sure. That'll give me time to get some experience to catch up with everybody." And I said, "Yeah, that sounds like a good idea." So I didn't check his sheet over. I probably should have. I mean, I gave it a glance over, but I didn't really look at it in depth. I saw that he had very specialized as half-ogre to be a spike chain specialist, because in 3.5, spike chains have a reach of 10, and half-ogre already has a reach, so basically anyone within about 20 feet, he could just reach out and smite and trip with this chain. So, he was like, "Oh, I can dominate anything in 20 feet. But the problem is that not a lot of stuff needs to be within 20 feet. So he starts walking along, to town, and I roll randomly for encounters. And one of the first encounters that I roll on him is a minor, a dragon wormling, I think it was a red dragon wormling or a green dragon wormling. And so I think, okay, I'm going to play this for comedy. And so I have this little dragon wormling pop up, and he's evil, so he's like, demanding gifts and demanding food. But he's not immediately attacking. He's basically this little pipsqueak little worm just like floating around in the air going, give me food, give me food. Or I'm going to, how dare you trespass in my territory? But it's only like about this long, right? So the half-ogre doesn't negotiate with it. He just starts insulting this thing, and as soon as it gets in range, whaps it with his chain. Does not kill it, manages to damage it. So I'm sitting there going, oh man. So the wormling takes off, flies up, and then starts doing the swoop down and strafe kind of thing. But he never comes within 20 feet again. And at this point, I realize that the half-ogre, another character with no ranged weapon, has no way to counteract this. So this half-ogre spends basically the next couple dozen rounds getting strafed every third or fourth round and trying to just dash for cover somewhere. And he's taking damage at this point. And finally, I don't want this guy to die like immediately to his first combat. I will do that on occasion, but at this point, this was a new person. I'd never actually played with them before. They joined the game, and I didn't really want to just take them out immediately. So I was like, yeah, sure, you see like a crumbled tower with like a dead dwarf there. And he goes up and he picks off he sees a crossbow on the dwarf's corpse. And at first he doesn't want to use it because crossbows aren't his thing. But eventually he takes a few pot shots off at the worm. And instead of staying around to fight, it flies away. I'm like, okay, you've basically driven this guy off. But at that point, I think he actually threw the crossbow away after that. I don't know why. I said, are you sure you want to do that? He said, yeah, crossbows aren't my style. And I'm like, okay, but if you get stuck in another range duel, I am not metagaming and saving your ass with another random encounter. I am just playing it as the dice roll and the maps dictate. So he was cool with that. So anyway, he goes and he finally catches up with the group, and at this time they're fighting fairly far into the kobold warrens, and so he joins up, and it was very awkward because the group really didn't have any reason to bring him aboard except for extra damage. And by this time they're starting to face a few devils, so they realize, yeah, we probably need somebody in there that's a hard hitter. So they let him join up, and they go in the way that they've been going, which is through this very, this human-sized door, which the half-ogre is size large, and he can squeeze through. But then there's this like little tiny tunnel, and I'm like, can the half-ogre even go through that? And he starts looking up, by the rules, yes, but I'm looking at his sheet, and I'm like, dude, you've got stuff on your gear that is larger than is going to fit in that hole. So yeah, he ended up, and I'm like, I know you can't squeeze your armor through that hole, because even piecemeal, the breastplate's not going to fit through that little tunnel, so he eventually ended up just sitting out there rather than going and fighting in a substandard thing. He just said, okay, well, I'll sit this adventure out. And then the adventure ended up taking like three more sessions, so eventually he just kind of gave up, and he made another character. He made another character that was human, and that was based on like a Grecian sort of ideal where you had this like the shield and this breastplate and this helmet, but he had javelins, and he would basically bring the shield up and just chuck javelins like a turret from behind it. And that one actually was, even though it was almost equally as goofy a concept, it actually worked a little bit well. So he brought this new character up, and I think it was the same guy. I'm pretty sure it was the same guy, because the Keranos, the warrior, cropped up about the same time that the half-ogre disappeared in my logs, so I'm presuming it's the same guy. Anyway, in and out of this dungeon, they've been meeting the half-ogre, and they've been meeting the new warrior. And the reason they've been able to do this is because they've been coming back to town to resupply and rest from time to time, and that's actually something that I really encourage in long-term dungeon crawls, is to not to go in and try and clear it all in one go. That allows me to make deadlier challenges and allows me to restock from time to time. So they go in, they clear some rooms, get a little bit further, uncover some clues, then go back to town, research those clues, and so forth. And at this point, they discover Number one, that the kobolds were basically inspired to do this by an outside source. And number two, they've also discovered the second segment of the storyline, because they start getting involved with this lord, this baron, the local baron called Lord Orus, who is a local noble and has basically informed them that the noblewoman that they rescued earlier, one of the reasons that the kobolds took her was because they're trying to revive this great evil vampire called the Bloodlord. And that noblewoman is a descendant of the group that locked the Bloodlord away in many centuries past. And that her sacrifice, her blood sacrifice, done on a certain date at a certain time, or at least a certain date under the light of the moon, I think, under the light of the full moon during a certain date, could be used to basically unlock the Bloodlord from his unearthly, captivity. So, they discover this, and Lord Orus just goes ahead and tells them most of the backstory. So they realize, well, we better keep an eye on this noblewoman too. So they start trying to arrange protection from her. They leave her with Lord Orus a lot of times. He's more than happy to go ahead and look after her because he knows the background. And but eventually, during some of these side trips, they start encountering these people called the Painbringers. And these are basically NPCs I designed around certain themes. Like one was a flail specialist, one was a ranged specialist, one was a certain type of cleric. And that's one thing I did like about 3.5. And it allowed you to make NPCs that felt as unique as players. You can do that with later stuff, but it takes a little bit more work to do. And it took a lot of work to do a completely custom NPC in 3.5, don't get me wrong, but at least the players felt like they were fighting people on a fair ground. But they did encounter some of them. As an example, one time they were in town and they encountered this lizard man who was basically specialized in combat maneuvers and the flail. So he would disarm people with a flail and then, keep them weaponless while he beat them down. And that actually ended up more than a match for the entire group that encountered him, even though he was of similar level, just because they weren't used to actually, using tactics. They did eventually take him down just with sheer numbers. During one of these combats, the paladin, actually not during one of them, but during several of them, the paladin started doing some questionable things. He started doing things like going up and just threatening to beat the hell out of kobolds that they captured. He started going all police state in terms of keeping people safe, but even to the point where he was harassing innocents. And normally I'm really flexible on alignment. You only really start trending out of one of the alignments when you start doing really egregious stuff. So I started keeping track of that, and I thought I'd warn him by having one of the Painbringers basically tempt away his newly acquired mount. He got his paladin's mount, and then almost immediately lost it because he was doing all this stuff. And I was like, yeah, well, one of the Painbringers comes and tempts away your mount. Oh, okay. And he tracked down this Painbringer because she left him some very, very challenging notes basically out in the morning. Basically doing the whole blackguard thing or the blackguard thing where there's like, haha, I have your mount. If you want to see them again, come to this amount, very over the top type stuff. So he gets out there and he ends up taking this challenge up and not telling the rest of the group. He just walks out there to challenge this Painbringer. Doesn't tell any of the group where he's going. Leaves in the dead of night without leaving any notice where he's going to anyone. Not even just the group, but anyone. So as far as they're concerned, he just leaves. So he goes out there to challenge this Painbringer, and then he discovers that the Painbringer was designed for the entire party to take on. So he challenges this Painbringer alone and gets killed. He just gets straight up killed out there. So the rest of the party, they kind of metagame it, being like, "Oh, well, I haven't seen Valdemar today. Well, well, where do you think he could be? I don't know. Well, maybe he went over here." And And so yeah, they metagamed it, but I let them get away with it. So they go and challenge this Painbringer, bring her down, get the Paladin's mount, uncorrupted, so to speak, and they bring the Paladin back, and they go ahead and have the Paladin raised. And at this point, I think the cleric NPC was the one to raise him. And so the Paladin gets brought back, and I took that opportunity to basically say, hey, man, while you're dead, your god basically pulls you aside and says, look, dude, some of the stuff you're doing is not okay, man. You need to slack off on it. I don't do the direct deity intervention. I usually don't, but in this point I did. I basically said, you know what? Your deity is basically there, and they said, you know what, you've been kind of an asshole. You need to back off on it. So he said, yeah, sure, I will. And he gets back there, and he was actually kind of griping out of character for a little bit, because he was expecting, I guess, to be able to face anything they encountered, like a more modern, design would say. He was like, I wasn't expecting this to fight like a CR8 creature all on myself, and I was basically, look, dude, this is an open world sandbox. If you want to, you can find out about a dragon, because you have found out about a dragon in this game. You can go out there and challenge them at level 1. I'm not going to stop you. The dragon will, but I'm not going to stop you from your own decisions. And he finally accepted it, but he said, well, I wouldn't have died if I'd known that if I'd had to take the entire group. And I was like, really? And he's like, well, I guess my character would have rushed off anyway. So it is my fault, but I was expecting an equal fight. I was like, no, you don't expect equal fights in my games, man. Especially not the old school style games. Even if I'm using a modern system, I will use a lot of old school stuff. So he learned the hard way about open world design. Anyway, they went ahead and by now it hooked up with Karanos, and they were going on a few side adventures here and there. One of them involved like a gnome in rescuing their this flesh golem from a gnome who was, yeah, it was weird. It was weird. The gnome was weird. It's not that I don't like gnomes, it's that I think the best gnomes are the weirdest gnomes. So that entire encounter was just strange. And it was strange. It was not strange in a good story way. It was just strange in a very, very goofy way. But eventually, it built up towards where it was coming time to where if the enemy was going to capture the noblewoman and sacrifice her, it was going to be soon. So they all gathered around the Baron Orus's keep, and they got raided. And it wasn't quite time for the main issue. It was still a couple days out. Some ogres attacked the keep, so they pushed the ogres back, and they followed the ogres off into the forest, where they discovered that there was this ruined tower keep just out there in the woods, and this seemed to be where the ogres came from. And once they get up there, they discover that not only are these ogres, but they're werewolf ogres. They're ogres with lycanthropy. Direwolf ogres. They would turn into direwolves. So they can see from the bottom, because it's not a very high keep. They can see like weird glows coming from up top, and they can hear chanting. They're like, oh no, another evil ritual. And so they hurry to race to the top of the keep. They don't stop to loot. They just, at this point, they're doing a fair amount of damage, especially that barbarian, especially Ragnar. He was just raging and smashing stuff out of the way. So they race up to the top of the keep, and actually they don't kill all of the werewolves. A couple of them follow them up. So they get to the top of the keep, and I have rolled. I have been keeping track of how many rounds it's taken, because this summoning ritual that they're doing takes a certain number of rounds. So they get up there, and they see the person doing the ritual, and then they see one of the largest armored ogres turns into a hybrid werewolf ogre form. And this, I don't know if you've heard this story before, is where he starts running up. The half ogre werewolf starts running up, and they're expecting, they get into defensive stance, expecting to take the claw bite routine. You got the paladin up there. They've just come up the stairs. You got the paladin up there on top. You got the barbarian right beside him, and the big hulking boss ogre / werewolf, ogre wolf, whatever, runs up and doesn't do the claw bite. No, he bull rushes him. Boom! Just smacks into Ragnar and knocks him off the side of the tower. Ragnar's like, crunch. And he takes like 3d6 falling damage, and he gets up and he brushes himself off and he starts running up the tower. So the ogre, the werewolf's fighting Valdemon, and there's a couple others that had chased him up that the rogue and the wizard and Keranos are taking care of on the back. They're taking care of them in a rear guard action, and they knock those ogres down. And Ragnar comes up the stairs and he's like, trying to just like running up the stairs, and then they clear some space for him. Ragnar gets up. Valdemon's holding his own with this ogre, but it's very clear that he's not going to kill this ogre werewolf by himself in time to stop the ritual. So Ragnar comes up, full enraged, can't quite attack because he just used all of his, he basically moved and then he used his action to move again or whatever, and he gets it up there. It's like, okay, I'm ready to attack next round. I'm like, okay. So the ogre looks at you standing there with your axe, and you're all like hulked up in rage mode. You're like, about to do some serious damage to him. So he bull rushes you again, and Ragnar's like, oh fuck. And then he rolls like a 1 or something to resist the bull rush, and he's like, oh no. Like, okay, so I'm not making it one roll. I'm like, oh yeah, you get a dex save to catch on the side, and he's like, no. And he rolls, and he rolls like a 2 or whatever, and he's like, oh. I'm like, okay, well, he knocks you off the tower again. So for the second time, same combat, Ragnar's like, crunch, and hits the bottom again. And he stands up and he brushes himself off, and he starts running up the stairs again. And so the countdown for the ritual is complete, but I've also put in a thing where it's basically to summon something. But the summon is delayed for 2d4 rounds. So I roll them, and I end up rolling like a 6 or a 7. So there's like 7 rounds in. So by now the backlog of the ogre's things is cleared up. So the guy with the Keranos, the guy with the javelin turret character, steps up, bypasses the ogre that's still raging and fighting Valdemon, and he throws a javelin at the caster who had been conducting this ritual and takes him out in 1 critical shot. Boom, caster goes down. And he's celebrating because he thought he got it in time, and everybody's celebrating because they thought they got it in time, but I know that he didn't get it in time because the casting had actually stopped the round before. So at this point, Ragnar, running up the stairs, comes up just in time, and by now Valdemon has pretty much beat this ogre down, but it's still there. And I'm like Ragnar, as you come to the top of the stairs, and Ragnar is just typing no, because it's all over text. He's like no. I'm like, yes, the ogre lycanthrope, the ogre werewolf bull rushes you again. Yep. Got knocked down. Failed to save to get it up, and he just fell down again. So, a 3rd time in a row. Crunch. And then that very next round, the combined might of the rest of the party drops the ogre. So everything's clear. And everything gets quiet. But I'm still counting everybody in rounds, and they're like, man, combat's over. Why are you still keeping track of rounds? I'm like, you let me keep track of it. You let me worry about that. You worry about you. So they're like, okay. So they start investigating the tower. Keranos walks over to one edge of the tower and starts looking over to make sure nobody's coming, because he knows you're still in combat. So he's like expecting some more enemies to rush out of the woods. And Arliss wanders down to start looking through the tower proper, and Ragnar's still running up the stairs again. And Valdemon looks over the other side, and their cleric is not with them at this point because they've got enough people that I figure that they can go ahead and take care of it. Plus, the cleric had some things to do. I had basically scheduled in. Oh, she needs to go to this place, just to keep her out of the thing, so they didn't have to lean on her like a crutch. So they get up there, and Magnus decides, hey, I'm going to start looking at what this ritual was. So Magnus walks out to the middle of the top of the tower, and there's this big ritual circle, and everything's pointing in the middle. So he's like, and he walks right in the middle, and he starts investigating it with Detect Magic. Now, in 3rd edition, Detect Magic will tell you if something's magical right off the bat, but you get more information the more time you spend looking at it. So he spends a couple rounds looking at this thing. And just on like the 6th or 7th round, I forget which, but just on the proper round, I'm like, well, it looks like a summoning circle to summon 4 wraiths. And he's like, to summon 4 wraiths? I said, yes, which appear beside you right now. So this wizard looks up, the wraiths appear. I give the rest of the party that's still on the top level, not Arliss because he's walked off, but I give Valdemon and I give Karanos, and I even give Ragnar. I say, everybody roll perception checks to see if you notice this. And none of them make them. I mean, at this point, some of them have pretty high adjustments for perception, but they all roll real low. And I set the DC as 10, if that, just to keep from being surprised. So they end up surprised. And then the wraiths end up rolling high. So almost instantly, the wraiths just boom, 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 just take Magnus down, and Magnus is instantly gacked. And he's kind of angry, but not really, because he was like, yeah, you got me that time. Yeah, I shouldn't have walked up there alone. I should have kept someone near me. I was like, yeah, probably. So they take him down. The wraiths are pretty easy pickings at this point. The rest of the party runs up and takes him down. So they don't have Mizzy Malini, the cleric, with them anymore. So they gather up Magnus's dead body and they take him back to Aris's keep. And they're like, yeah, we wiped out the people that were coming after the girl. And he said, good. And he said, but we lost our wizard. And Aris was like, that's not a problem. I can raise him. I'm a cleric. So at this point, Valdemon is like, man, do I detect evil on him? And I'm like, no, you don't detect evil on him. He's like, okay. All right, what kind of cleric is he? And I'm like, well, he's a cleric of the Divine Ascendant, which is the monotheistic thing I use for this particular one. But the issue is that I also had an evil kind of deity level entity called the Adversary. And I basically made it out like a Satan style thing where they still used the same sort of culture and scriptures as the main people, as the Divine Ascendant people, just kind of in opposite. And they had clerics too. And so Valdemon was a little suspicious, but he was okay. And so Aris walks off and he raises Magnus. And on a side note, I'd also had a homebrew. I don't know. I think it was homebrew. I don't know where I got it, but I think it was homebrew. I think I may have got it from an earlier thing. But when you got raised, you did not know what situation you were going to be in. However, what you did get was the name of the person that was raising you and their alignment. So, Mizzy Bellini, the chaotic good cleric, wants to raise you. And then you could decide on that whether you wanted to take the resurrection or take the raise. You could decide to declare it. I'd been playing a little bit too much in terms of MMOs at the time, but yeah. They got basically they got this spiritual checkbox where they said accept res, yes. And so I go Magnus. I said Magnus, Marcus Aurus, Baron Marcus Aurus, the lawful evil cleric wants to raise you. And I typed this to him in message because it's a text-based medium. So he's like, lawful evil, eh? Yeah, sure. I'll take the raise. So yeah, so Magnus gets raised, and And he looks Oris over with the detect magic real quick, and Oris has a belt of non-detection, I think it was, which basically gives you protection against scrying spells and things like detection spells. So, Magnus is like, okay, all right, not a problem. But he doesn't tell anybody. And he's like, normally it would be my idea to tell people, but I'm not going to tell anybody. And he was like, but I'm just grateful for the raise. Let's focus on protecting this noblewoman. So they go ahead and basically mount this major defense of Oris's keep, and they get somebody comes up there, and they raid the keep, and they've got a couple pain bringers with them, and they're fighting, and they actually get a hold of the girl, and they start carrying her away. Once again, they set out to rescue this noblewoman, who, and I know it sounds like I'm doing the trope where, oh yeah, the woman gets captured or whatever. This noblewoman was a high-level swashbuckler. She was no joke. She was, she could hold her own, but the party didn't believe it. And they basically took steps that basically interfered with her holding her own. So she did end up getting captured. And, it just goes to show, when you've got an NPC you need to protect, sometimes it's better to just give them a weapon and say, hey, join the fight, Anyway, so they go chase this woman down. And this time Marcus Aura is with them. She says, okay, I'll go with you because you need a cleric. I'm like, yeah, sure. So they go out there right after her. And they go ahead and they catch up, and they start slaughtering the Painbringer's minions, and they had some summons there, and they summoned devils, and they went in and slaughtered those summoned devils. And so finally they got one last Painbringer. The Painbringer draws this dagger, draws this knife, and starts saying, okay, I'm going to sacrifice you to free the Bloodlord. And, the moon's riding high in the sky. It is time for the ritual, and everybody's closing in on her. And one of them disarms her knife, and it goes flying. Say, oh, okay, I kick it back there towards the back of the group. And Marcus Aurus is standing there saying, yeah, go to it. Take her down. And then another person is like, okay, I grab the noblewoman. I can't even remember the noblewoman's name. I wrote it down. I don't have any more things. I grab her and pull her away, and I'm like, make contested strength checks, and this is Ragnar doing it. So Ragnar just rips her out of the Painbringer's arms and says, here, I'll toss her to the back to Marcus Aurus. And Marcus Aurus is like, yeah, okay, I got her. And he puts her down, and she's still tied up. She's struggling, like, let me go. And then they turn and they start raining blows on the Painbringer, and they take the Painbringer down. The Painbringer falls over, and they're like, yes, we've stopped the sacrifice. And Marcus Aurus has got the noblewoman in one hand, and he's got the dagger in the other. And the group turn, they're like, and I look, and I type that in. I say, so Marcus Aurus is standing in the back. He's got the noblewoman in one hand, and he's got the sacrificial dagger in the other. And everybody's just typing. My character turns around and says, looks at Marcus Aurus, like, what are you doing? And Magnus the wizard is like, God damn it! The one time I don't say anything about somebody detecting evil. And I'm like, he sacrifices her. Boom. He's got initiative. It's his initiative turn. He coup de graces her and kills her. The sky turns red, and the moon turns red, and then they're all sitting there typing, no, and typing their attacks in, regardless of whether it's their turn or not. And I'm like, so dawns Act 3. And so they rush off to take this guy down. Now, one last thing before I go on that note is that Remember when I said that the paladin had been called aside by his god during his quote-unquote timeout when he died and said, you need to straighten your act up? Well, he hadn't. He had continued to act like a complete jackass. He had continued to threaten people. He actually went out, and when this whole thing was going on, one of the reasons they found out where the ogres and such were was because he had stopped and tortured one of the prisoners. So as the blood moon spreads, I gave him a little time to try to justify what he did, and part of the reason I gave him a little time is because he was not using his paladin powers. But at this point, when he starts to try to smite Marcus Aurus with his smite evil, I'm like, and they do kill him. They kill him pretty quick, but he was like, okay, I smite evil on Marcus Aurus, and I'm like, it doesn't work. And he's like, because he's not evil, he's clearly evil. I'm like, no, because your powers are gone. So at the same time that the Bloodlord was released, the Paladin found out that he done fucked up. So I will leave it at that, and I will continue with the conclusion of the campaign and the various adventures thereof in the next RPG Storytime. Thank you for watching. This has been the RPG Crawler. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you got any feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. Until next time, take care and goodbye.